Joining me to do exactly that is Jack Rowlett, political commentator with Young Voices. Jack, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you feeling about this early release scheme? The government will say this is a necessary evil.
Well, I think, unfortunately, it is. We haven't built enough prisons for a long time. We just don't have the capacity. It's not really the Labour government's fault. This has been a longer-term issue that the Tories didn't deal with. But I think the optics of this really couldn't be worse for the government. And I think this could become a massive problem for them in the coming months, because even if, the vast majority of these offenders who are being released don't commit offences again, even if it's just a handful who do, that the press are going to be right there reporting those stories, that it's going to be talked about, that it's really going to capture the public imagination.
I mean, that's already started. The Sun have been speaking to a probation staff insider who say this is a risky move. It is inevitable that many will reoffend. We can only do our best to minimise any harm to the general public. I mean, Jack, you'd think these people are going out at 40% of their sentence rather than 50%. I wonder, some of those who would have come out earlier may well have reoffended anyway.
Yeah, maybe, but I think there's also the problem of you're kind of reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic in a sense, because you're moving the problem that you have where you don't have the capacity within prisons to, releasing these offenders, but then not having the capacity within the probation service to be monitoring them. So they're really damned if they do and damned if they don't. And it's going to take a long time to fix this problem, because we have to build more prisons and we have to hire more staff. And I do think there is possibly the prospect that Labour does manage to make some progress on this issue over the next 5 years, but actually it's not enough progress for the public, and they've kind of solved the problem, but it ends up being a government of a different party who comes in and gets to have the credit for it.
The government haven't denied the fact that they've potentially looked at options, including sending prisoners here to Estonia. Would you be supportive of that?
Well, if it means that we don't have, people who are likely to reoffend on the streets, then yeah, I think it's not something I would like to be doing in an ideal world. But ultimately, the government's, one of the government's first duties is to keep people safe. And given that there aren't enough prison spaces, drastic action has to be taken.
Yeah, I mean, that would be drastic, I think, for the people running prisons. It's very problematic when you've got anyone in jail far from their family, their network, wherever they might be going to court. You've got an awful lot more logistics and complexity than when you've got flights, and it sounds hugely complicated. It's something the government haven't ruled out. Front page of the Times today, it says the law enforcement agency at the forefront of Keir Starmer's plan to smash the gangs is in crisis, losing more officers than it recruits, and really suffering from what the Times describe as a brain drain. What's going on here, Jack?
Well, I think this is another example of a real theme that's emerging, which is every part of the state is completely falling apart. And every part of the state is having staffing shortages. The workforce has shrunk. They've been recruiting new officers, but the attrition rate has fallen. They've got a huge number of senior managers leaving every year. I don't know if it's a cultural issue or if it's a pay issue, but it clearly needs urgent attention from the government. And then they're not going to be able to deal with the issue of, small boats with immigration problems if they don't sort out the National Crime Agency. And it's not just those issues as well, because it goes to other, areas of serious crime, as you'd expect, tackling, the worst sorts of crime that really kind of attract public attention and that people prioritize in terms of wanting to be cut. So again, this is another part of the state that's completely creaking, that needs investment to sort out, but there's no money. And so the government is, it doesn't really have many options. It's just having to trundle on. And I kind of feel like the grim kind of approach that we've seen from Starmer so far. He had his speech a couple of weeks ago saying that everything was terrible. And I thought, well, it can't be that bad. Let's have a bit of hope and optimism. But actually, every day we're just getting news stories like this. The state is completely on its knees.
Well, that's why they're having to make decisions about, taking winter fuel allowance away from some pretty poor pensioners. Front page of the Telegraph has the health secretary. They say Wes Streeting has said he's not remotely happy with the plan. I imagine what we'll hear from Wes Streeting is, I'm not happy, but we are forced to make this decision.
Yeah, I mean, since the financial crash, it has been primarily families and children who've borne the brunt of government cuts to entitlements and benefits, and pensioners have had it pretty good. They've had the triple lock, they've had the winter fuel allowance, they had far more support than any other group during the cost of living crisis. And, I don't think in an ideal world anyone wants to be taking away the winter fuel allowance, but ultimately pensioners have to bear some of the burden too. 25% of pensioners are millionaires. The average weekly income of a pensioner now is higher than a worker for the first time in history. And this was a universal payment being handed out to lots and lots of people who don't need it. Of course, the problem is that, the floor for this, setting the floor as being the floor for pension credit, means that you are going to have a number of pensioners who do need more support who now aren't going to get it. And it's another example of the state falling apart because we actually don't have the IT systems, we don't have the infrastructure to be tracking kind of other metrics other than who's eligible for pension credit. So there isn't an easy way for the state to set the threshold at a different level.
Yeah, well, and wherever it gets set, of course, there'll be people on the edge who will suffer. I think people looking at how do you think they should vote, Jack? Because, for a pensioner living, I think the assumption that's sort of baked into this is that pensioners will own their own homes, which of course not all do. So if you are a pensioner as an individual in your household, the threshold is at £12,000. I mean, £12,000 a year in terms of income, and you lose that. I mean, there are going to be lots of people for whom this does really hit them hard.
Yeah, there are, absolutely. And, times are tough and the government has to make these tough choices. And I think given that we saw earlier this year, Keir Starmer coming out very forcefully and saying, no, we are going to keep the cap on child benefit. That has to stay in place, despite the fact that, child poverty rose to a record rate this year. Given that he made that decision, I think it would be a generational crime, really, if he were to backtrack on the winter fuel allowance. So I think he absolutely should strip the whip of any Labour MP who votes against the government on this.
Okay. Right, we'll see how they vote tomorrow. There's been a lot of talk about sort of reform of education and in particular Ofsted. There's an interesting piece inside the Times this morning. The former head of Ofsted said teachers should never be afraid to tell aggressive parents they're a bad example to their children. It's not necessarily that easy to do.
No, it's not. I mean, especially if they are aggressive. Teachers are not going to want to do that. I mean, teachers, I think, already have quite a lot on their plate as it is. But it is a big problem. We've seen attendance rates have dropped since the pandemic. We've seen problems with parents not being, willing to kind of work with teachers to ensure that their child's attendance rate goes up. It's a really difficult thing to handle. And I don't think teachers, if they're kind of coming out and tackling parents, I don't think it's really going to help, because if the parents are aggressive in the first place, then you're not going to be able to have a good dialogue, and it's not going to solve the problem. Ultimately, I think, there has to be some sort of enforcement on the parents. If they're being aggressive, you have to be able to come in with fines or other sorts of punishments, because that's the way you can stop that sort of behaviour, rather than, putting it on teachers to try and calm things down.
Yeah, the advice was never be afraid to tell a parent that they're a bad parent. We know deteriorating behaviour since the pandemic has become a major concern. That's where you kind of, the debate reigns about the responsibilities that teachers have, whether it's things like doing teeth brushing and actual parenting rather than just the teaching. There's a funny classroom story that we should get onto in just a moment. But tell me, Jack, is it important when England go out to play a game that the manager sings the national anthem or not? Where do you fall on this?
Well, I think the most important thing is what happens on the pitch. And I can tell you, I was more entertained by England's game against Ireland the other day than I was ever entertained by any of England's games under Gareth Southgate. And that is just so much more important. oh, there was such a good system. There was a clear tactical idea. Whenever a player had the ball, they clearly knew what they were supposed to do with it. We had lots of the ball, but there wasn't this thing that we had under Southgate where we'd have lots of possession against sides like Ireland, but they wouldn't know what to do with it, and they'd just be looking round, and it would be so slow. So yeah, it was so good, and I think that's the most important thing. Frankly, I don't care what Lee Carsley or whoever takes on the England job full time does on the sidelines, as long as the results on the pitch are good.
Okay, right. That's one vote for, one vote against then, because I would quite like it. Ultimately, I don't really, really care, but I think it doesn't feel in the team spirit to stand there in silence at the very beginning. Jack, I said there was a fun classroom story at Teacher Tap. They do these reviews, daily reviews with teachers to find out, what's happening in their working day. And they've asked teachers for some of the best excuses, or I think we could say the worst, for why you'd be late to school. And some of them raise more than a few eyebrows.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you these are beyond anything I came up with as a child, but we've had delivering baby animals. We've had stopping at Greg's, which of course is very important.
That's quite a common excuse for being late. But more than one child said, sorry, I was late because I've been in Greg's.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can understand it, to be honest. I think we've all been there, really. But yeah, rehousing chickens as well. I mean, it's insane what some of these children are coming up with. But of course, it's a funny story, but it is also a big problem because these if you're late every day, it might only be like 20 minutes, half an hour, but over the lifetime of a child, their school career, it really does add up, and it does have an impact on income later in life.
Well, here we go. Someone was 40 minutes late after they were locked in a cemetery. I wonder what happened there. One teenager said they were late because their eyebrow colour wasn't correct. That would, I'm sure, garner no sympathy. But another said they were stuck on top of a wardrobe. That turned out to be a genuine excuse. It was a drama pupil looking for a prop who was trapped after someone removed the ladder. That's terrible. That was very cruel, whoever did that. And imagine you'd think, no one's going to believe me. Anyway, Jack, did you ever give a reason, a legitimate reason for being late? Stuck on top of a wardrobe?
No, I was always on time for school, religiously on time. I am religiously on time for everything, so I never had to come up with an excuse as ridiculous as a blue food dye mishap with some waffles.
Yeah, that's in
when
there.
I was in school.
Jack, thank you very much. Jack Rowlett, political commentator.